You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Incoming Governor-elect J.B. Pritzker made water safety at the Quincy Veterans Home a major issue on the campaign trail. Now, in January, he's set to inherit a major cleanup project estimated to be worth some $250 million at that facility alone, and potentially an even bigger headache, preventing another outbreak at any other number of old, outdated state facilities where experts say they are most likely to happen. That brings us to our guest who's joining us today, Brad Considine.
Yeah, correct. Thanks,
and
Mark.
You're with the Alliance to Prevent Legionnaires' Disease.
Yes, based out of D.C.
Based out of D.C., a national group.
Yep.
You look at different instances of Legionella bacteria that pop up. And tell me a little bit first, introduce us to the idea of this alliance, what it does and why it exists.
We formed the Alliance in 2015. It was an outgrowth of a group that was involved with building the only building standard to address Legionella that was introduced in 2015 called ASHRAE Standard 188.
So this is a standard that applies to buildings, structures, and the pipes, the way the water gets.
And how to manage and how to mitigate Legionella risk in buildings.
How do you do that?
Well, there's a variety of ways. I mean, there's conditions that set up for the bacteria to be able to develop. Uh-huh. And so wherever you have water, you tend to have life, and water needs to be managed. So you want to be able to keep the water moving through the facility. You want to be able to treat it where you can treat it. And
you don't want sitting pools of water, stagnation.
Right. Stagnation is an issue. If the water accumulates organics, it serves as a nutrient. So at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is create a hostile environment for the bacteria, which is not an unusual bacteria. It's relatively easy to find. It's naturally in the environment, and in fact, it comes in through the source waters into our water system.
So a lot of reporters in Illinois have learned a lot about Legionella and Legionnaires as this issue struck the Quincy Veterans Home in 2015.
Right.
The same year that your group started. Tell me a little bit about how you became aware of that issue, and I guess the question, how you've seen Legionnaires across the country in a lot of different places, right?
Right.
How did this issue compare to others, and how would you grade the state in their response to what happened?
Well, when I think about this issue, we know that the beginning back in 2015, but what we didn't keep track of was how it persisted in the facility and what the original findings might have been. We really became more aware of the persistence later last year. What we liked about the conversation in Illinois is Illinois was taking a holistic, systemic kind of perspective rather than just a very narrow kind of focus on a point of distribution. So what I mean by a broad system focus, they were looking at the entire campus, the plumbing and piping and so forth, which is critical because this bacteria is a water system related issue, not a single building.
Right, so we talked at the beginning of this interview about how water, you regulate it and you treat it in the building itself, but obviously the water comes from a source. I believe at the Quincy Veterans Home, that source may have been the Mississippi River, and that water source can be a number of different places, and then it gets to the glass. And by the way, you can't get sick from Legionnaires by drinking it. I believe you have to inhale it somehow.
Well, yes, except for aspiration. And aspiration is when it goes down the wrong pipe. So basically, I recognize after I learned about aspiration, I do that more than I think, what I would have thought I would. But it needs to get in your lungs because it is a form of pneumonia.
Introduced to your respiratory system, then you're in danger.
Right.
So looking at the state, the Rauner administration and the state of Illinois made the argument that, well, the Legionella may have been introduced from the Mississippi River when that land was kicked up. I think there were some tornadoes in the area. There was some strong wind. Is that a reasonable theory? Is that possible?
Well, absolutely. In fact, we see higher rates of Legionnaires around the country where the source waters are from surface sources, in other words, rivers and lakes. You think back to another big event that started in 2015 was the outbreak, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan.
Sure.
And it was not only lead, it was a major Legionella outbreak. And that was where they changed the source water famously over to the Flint River.
Right, and they created a whole host of new problems.
The month that they changed over, the rates spiked. And they stayed at a high level until they switched back to the Detroit water that they were originally getting. Flint, Michigan is a clear case of how a system can drive an outbreak. So there's not enough science around this yet. That's the issue, and I think people are trying to draw conclusions, and quite frankly, as a society, we haven't gotten enough science to know how to manage this issue, and that's where we have to take it. This bacteria was first discovered in 1976, which isn't that long ago when you think about
Sure.
medicine and so forth, and it was associated with a convention of American Legion members in Philadelphia.
So how would you compare the risk to people at home who may live in a single structure residence compared to that of someone who lives in a larger apartment building or a large condominium or say a nursing home or a hospital? Are those larger facilities, because there are more pipes and sort of small waterways going through there, are they at greater risk than a single structure home, or is it the same? And what do people at home need to know about what this risk means for them?
Right, there's a lot of factors. I think we all have exposure to this bacteria. I think it's that prevalent. I think if your body's healthy, your body defends you from it. If you are immune compromised or have some underlying health issue, you're more at risk,
The
which
young,
is why we
the
want to
sick,
educate.
and the elderly, I think, are at greater risk.
They're far greater risk, which is why there's stricter requirements at healthcare facilities today than there used to be. But on your question about complex buildings, there is a bigger challenge, because if the water, plumbing systems and so forth aren't designed well, you can have what they refer to as dead legs, so water that goes somewhere and sits. Stagnation's generally not good. Buildings that shut down a floor and then try to resume operation later on can have an issue at the outset.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's opportunities there, and that was the standard that we worked on to first develop it. The issue we have is you can't manage this whole issue only on buildings, because 96% of the cases are individual and sporadic, which means there's a number of cases that are happening other than outbreaks.
Individual and sporadic as compared to what?
Versus an outbreak. So an outbreak, generally the Centers for Disease Control defines an outbreak as essentially 2 or more cases from a very common location.
Sure.
So individual and sporadic cases aren't investigated, which we think is a real problem. And we're calling for more investigations of those individual cases so that we can get a better understanding what's going on in the water system. In the Bronx, when they had their big outbreak in 2015, there were cases leading into that major outbreak, and they were not investigated, even though the families are trying to get investigations. And in our opinion, that is akin to missing the canary in the coal mine, for what the risk is. So we got to understand the system issues that are going on.
Once the patient becomes sick or ill,
Yeah.
Is there any reason to believe that maybe doctors have misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed Legionnaires in the past?
I think there's a general sense that it's probably been underdiagnosed. And today, if anybody were to have conditions that were flu-like and lung-related, and if you have underlying health conditions, you can ask for a simple urinary antigen test. And that is not a perfect test, but it's a very good marker to determine whether they have Legionnaires or not.
So there are structures and buildings and hospitals and nursing homes and all kinds of facilities that scatter across the state and, of course, the country that have existing pipes, that have structures that are in place.
Right.
Aside from doing what we're doing at the Quincy Veterans Home, which is gutting it all out and rebuilding it, what can they do, and what does your group recommend to secure and satisfy the people's concerns who may walk into it? Like, for instance, this building here has been exposed to Legionella, you may be aware. And
right.
What do big buildings like this do to secure their water and to tell the people that come to the facility that they're safe?
First thing they need to do is work with the water utility to understand the quality of water that comes into the building. That's what a building owner starts with, is the water that comes in.
So the source from where they get it, right?
So, and we know from infrastructure problems, water main breaks, flooding, construction, other disruptions to the system, you break loose the biofilm that's inside, and inside the biofilm that coats the pipes is the bacteria, Legionella, and other items, and they come into the building. That can be the first point of entry. Now when it lands in the building, there's a variety of ways to kind of manage that water once it comes to the building. And that standard 188 that ASHRAE introduced in 2015 provides 40 pages of how to mitigate the risk of Legionella in a building. But the building side, I think there's lots of opportunity, but we can't get enough focus on the water source side, and that's what we're trying to drive.
Very interesting. So you say trying to drive. What do you seek to accomplish at the source and at the building? What are your recommendations?
So the recommendations that we've had is, first of all, we think there should be regular testing of the general water system so that we can understand the activity of what's going on and get a little bit of transparency.
So more testing.
More testing. We do like the proposal from the Illinois EPA this year to revamp all their water guidelines and water standards. It's something that they started 6 years ago. It wasn't driven by Legionnaire's disease, but it includes some things that should improve the water quality coming into the buildings. One of those things it includes a requirement for a minimum residual disinfectant at all points of distribution. And why that's important is if that bacteria gets released into the water system, you want to have the disinfectant present to address the threat and to kill the bacteria. But as you go downstream in a water system, you tend to lose the disinfectant that was applied at the treatment facility. So at all points of distribution, you can have a booster station to add in the disinfectant. Those kind of measures, I think, are very sound and help to build a fundamental improvement in the water quality coming into the buildings.
All right. Brad Considine with the Alliance to Prevent Legionnaires' Disease. Just got a bit of a look at what some lawmakers will be studying closely as they look at ways to make the state safer and the water supply safer across the state and yet the country. So Brad, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We'll be back in just a moment.